We conducted the most comprehensive study around Gen Z at work, and what we discovered was a massive gap between Gen Z and leadership. There is absolutely no point in finger pointing and labeling. Both parties must come to the table, but this has to be led by leadership. After all, the first four letters in leader is lead. And then I said to him, I said, you really need to invest in employee engagement. And his reaction was typical Tony, slightly kind of provocative, slightly cheeky. And his response was, why should I invest in employee engagement? After all, I pay them, don't I? The trick here is to take a disengaged staff member and then convert them into an engaged staff member, correct? And that gap is $41,600. And I don't think leaders really understand the economics.
I was involved in creating processes to make us up to date. It was really, really hard to get across the line. So you're asking us to create change and then not really letting us. And I think that kind of creates an animosity.
Then you've got Gen Z that are the digital generation. From the moment they were born, some of them had an iPhone in their hand and intuitively used that iPhone. So the Gen Z, they want things to move quickly. They don't respect hierarchy, but they do the why. I see it as a leadership issue, not as a generational issue.
I think Gen Z is comfortable with challenging authority as well, but I don't think that it necessarily comes from a nasty place. I think it comes from, like you said, we want to know why and we want to have the reason why. Being told just isn't a good enough excuse anymore because we have such instant access to knowledge.
And 42% of the Gen Z people in Australia said they don't get frequent constructive feedback to help them grow. So what's driving the constructive feedback is this deep desire to grow. They're not getting it. And if they did, engagement levels would go up by like 46%.
The Gen Zs are asking for that feedback and it's putting some leaders on the spot.
56% of Gen Z women and 48% of Gen Z men feel no encouragement to have an open dialogue or share suggestions, which is really sad.
I think it's kind of an apathy in the senses, if I say something, will it matter? Will it be heard? Will it be listened to? And then if I do something, it's what's the point?
Flexible work is a big thing for this generation. Why are Australian leaders reticent around this? Is it lack of trust?
We don't respect the power of diversity. Much better to have different views because out of the difference comes that gem of an idea that makes a huge difference to whatever it is we're doing.
If Gen Z can make one mindset shift happen among Australian leaders tomorrow, what would it be?
Respect Gen Zs, involve them, respect their different view of the world and use it to your advantage.
What's the biggest thing Gen Z has taught you?
You know what I respect with Gen Z is their thirst for knowledge.
I think they're the most socially aware generation. Strangely enough, I almost feel like we bridged the gap today. Welcome to another episode of Strategy Edge, where we share insight-based strategic solutions. Today, we will discuss the greatest challenge that Australian leaders face, which is how to inspire and lead Gen Z. We conducted the most comprehensive study around Gen Z at work, and what we discovered was a massive gap between Gen Z and leadership. Global studies, in fact, suggest that Gen Z is the most disengaged generation ever in terms of work, and 1 in 2 are planning to leave their current job within 2 years. Given that this will soon be the largest cohort of workers, this is a serious issue. And let's not forget that Gen Alpha is just around the corner. There is a lot of discussion around productivity. And one of the easiest ways I believe for leaders to learn is to learn how to effectively lead Gen Z. There is absolutely no point in finger pointing and labeling. Both parties must come to the table, but this has to be led by leadership. After all, the first 4 letters in leader is lead. Today, I'm excited to tell you that in our discussion today, we have Monika, an enthusiastic and passionate Gen Z person who will represent Gen Z, and Tony Chamberlain, who will represent leaders. Tony is a coach and mentor to CEOs in his role as chair at Vistage, and there is no better person to represent leadership in Australia in this discussion. But first up, let me just introduce our young Gen Z voice, which is Monika Lombard. I spoke to her a couple of days ago, and she's very articulate, very passionate. And in her short span of career, her career path has not been linear. It's been a range of things, which I'll share with you in a second. So she started out in psychology studies back in New Zealand, and she shifted gears into recruitment and operations before making a bold move to Melbourne. And there, her curiosity and determination landed her a role at iSphere Global, where she now manages major accounts in the fintech space. She brings to the table a fresh Gen Z perspective that is shaped by adaptability, resilience, and a willingness to try new things. Whether it was competing in hockey, navigating hospitality, to build new connections in a new country, or diving headfirst into fintech, she's embraced every challenge with energy and spontaneity. Today, she's here not just as a professional in the world of payments, risk, and basically collections, but as a voice for her generation. A generation that is truly redefining what work, purpose, and leadership means in modern business. Welcome, Monika.
Thanks, Chris. Lovely to be here.
Now, let me talk about Tony Chamberlain, who I know personally for many years now. Tony used to be a client of ours, and he is that rare CEO. And trust me, we worked with 50 to 100 brands, that rare CEO that understands the value of employee engagement and customer engagement and understands the economics behind it as well. He is a leader that goes to the front, and that's probably one thing that really defines him as a leader. He's willing to get his hands dirty and go to the front. He was an undercover boss, and his experiences in that were really, really great. He literally went in disguise and really got to understand exactly what the front line were going through. Um, Tony is a strong leader, but he's also very empathetic, which is like a great combination to have. Let me talk about our history together. I initially met Tony where I, got him into the whole Net Promoter Score world. And when I got him to the Net Promoter Score world, what was really refreshing, and this is a defining thing, you know, if you don't get the CEO on board as far as Net Promoter Score is concerned, the program is going to fail. And Tony was 100% behind it. And like I said, he got his hands dirty and he led from the front. And we worked with him in terms of developing the strategy, sharing the insights, and so on and so forth. But none of it would have been possible without Tony's leadership. And he literally, his Net Promoter Score was already high, and he literally doubled it, so improved it by 100%. And when I talk about being front on, one of the tools we shared with Tony was the speed ideation process, where frontline leaders can get their teams together, involve them, because without involvement, there's no actual commitment, and get them to ideate very quickly some ideas. And the interesting thing was that Tony was the best facilitator of speed ideation in the entire organization, and his staff shared that with me. But I want to share an interesting anecdote, which is very pertinent in terms of today's discussion with Tony. After we did stuff with the Net Promoter Score and customer experience, we also did some leadership work with his leadership team. And then I said to him, I said, you really need to invest in employee engagement. And his reaction was typical Tony, slightly kind of provocative, slightly cheeky. And his response was, why should I invest in employee engagement? After all, I pay them, don't I? And he was waiting for my response. And I immediately shared my response. I said, let me show you some stats. That was the next slide. And the next slide basically said, in terms of stated loyalty, engaged staff were, 3 times more loyal than disengaged staff. But the second point, which was even more interesting, is that they gave you twice as much discretionary effort. And as a leader, he could actually see the impact on productivity there. And the last thing I said is, when it comes to engaged versus disengaged staff, engaged staff will happily recommend not only their organization as a great place to work, but the organization's products and services, while disengaged staff will not recommend it as a great place to work and not even recommend its services. And as soon as I did that, he jumped in and, as usual, got his hands dirty and jumped in completely, led from the front. And after we did the employee engagement survey, he then led some of the work group facilitations and so on and so forth, and then the employee engagement went up as well. So at this stage, given that, so first of all, welcome Tony to this. Now I want to share with you something very interesting, which is the actual economics. So for this exercise, it wasn't from our study. We did a global analysis of the economic impact of engaged versus disengaged Gen Z employees, specifically Gen Z. So we work on a basis that the average salary for a Gen Z is 60,000 Australian dollars, right? So keep that in the back of your mind. So once we do that, let's look at engaged staff. Engaged staff, the first thing they give you is productivity improvements. So they go above and beyond. They are innovative. They find new ways to improve efficiency, new ideas, et cetera, et cetera. That equates to approximately 23% of the annual salary, so around $13,800. You avoid turnover cost, you avoid absenteeism, but the net result, without any double counting, is $13,800, so 23% of the person's salary, right? Now let's look at disengaged staff. So this is where the problem arises. The loss in productivity, this is based on people like Gallup, is around 18%. So that's $10,800. The cost of replacing staff, remember what I said, it's around 50 to maybe 150%. But given that these are kind of largely entry-level kind of positions, we've gone really conservative here and said the rehiring cost is only 22.5%, which is very, very low, by the way. And that comes to like a loss of minus 13,500. Absenteeism is the next one. It's just 6%. So they tend to, take more leave and all that. And that's 6%, so that's 3,500. The net negative impact of a disengaged staff member is minus 27,800, right? Now, the trick here is to take a disengaged staff member and then convert them into an engaged staff member, correct? And that gap is $41,600. And I don't think leaders really understand the economics. So the issue is, if you can actually take your disengaged Gen Z employees, even 10 of them, right, and convert them into being engaged, the bottom line impact is like 410 or 1,000. Now, the interesting thing is, this is not a line item in your balance sheet, but the impact is there. It's kind of a little bit invisible, but the impact is there. So that was the economic impact I want to share. And as I take you through the studies and the findings there, I want you to keep this in the back of your mind, that if you just take one person and move them from being disengaged to engaged, the improvement in productivity, lower absenteeism, lower rehiring costs is massive. And the impacts on the bottom line are huge, even though it's not a line item in there. So having said that, on a very somber kind of note, a somber economic note, let's start with some of the questions. So just some general issues. Let's start with Monika. So as someone in the early years of your career, What have you heard from your peers in terms of leaders? Do they truly listen? Do they truly understand your generation? What are you hearing out there?
Um, so I think like most issues, that's quite a like there's no straightforward answer for that. I think it varies from industry to industry and management team to management team. However, in saying that, I think a general consensus that Gen Z like people are saying that we need is leaders understand that the world is changing, and I think leaders are even willing to create jobs for change and transformation, like in that space. But I think the delivery of change is like meets a lot of red tape. What I mean by that is, well, as an anecdote, I've got an example. As I was started working at a job, I was involved in creating processes to make us up to date, and I tried to implement software and it worked really well, but it was just the fact that it was implementing software. It was really, really hard to get across the line, explaining the benefits of a new system is really, really hard for a younger generation to do as well. So you're asking us to create change and then not really letting us, and I think that kind of creates an animosity between Gen Z
The
and
generations. Yeah. One of the strongest things, and we'll kind of cover this later on. One of the strongest things a leader can do is give Gen Z a voice. Just give them a voice, and you can literally improve engagement to almost like, perfection levels. But anyway, we'll kind of cover that later. So Tony, with your experience, so Tony, I should mention, is now chairman at Vistage, and in his role, he mentors and helps develop and supports, a range of CEOs and leaders, right? So he is kind of like so well placed in terms of giving us a pulse of what leadership are thinking about this. So what are you hearing in your conversations, Tony, with Gen Z? Are people expressing concern around this generation in particular?
I think, I think we make too much actually of Gen Zs. And I think if you look at history, we had the sleeper generation that were brought up with recession, or depression, with world wars, with workforce where you'd go to one company and you'd stay there, you'd work for life, you'd focus on family. Then you had the hippie generation, free love, all of that. Now you imagine the sleeper generation managing the hippie generation. Then you've got the baby boomers that they've had everything on their side: economic growth, industrialization, moving from job to job, focusing on building wealth. Could be the luckiest generation. Then you've got Gen Z that are the digital generation. Everything from the moment they were born, some of them had an iPhone in their hand and intuitively used that iPhone. So the Gen Z, they want things to move quickly. They don't respect hierarchy, but they do respect the why. If you're talking to a Gen Z and you give them the why, now that makes sense to me. Now I know what I'm doing. And as you said, if you work and understand what it is that motivates them, you'll get a great result. I see it as a leadership issue, not as a generational issue. They're just different, and we need to respect difference.
Yeah. It's interesting what you said. I was in a board meeting, and a few, of the audience were talking about the challenges of Gen Z, and I don't know what's going to happen. And at that time, it wasn't Gen Z; it was the millennials they were whinging about. And then the eldest board member, who was the chairman of the group as well, he made an interesting observation. He said, the hippie generation included people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and we all thought that they would be useless. And look at what became of them. So Yep, things change. And there's this song, this Australian song, every generation blames the one before, and every older generation makes fun of the young generation. So there is a sense, though, Tony, that in this particular instance, it runs a little bit deeper. Do you think the gaps in thinking is much bigger?
The gap in thinking of Gen Z or the people that are managing Gen Z?
I think it's like maybe the gap in terms of values. You touched on it before. The older generation was more materialistic, more interested in getting ahead, more driven by ego-based kind of needs, if I can call it that. While this young generation is not as interested in, as an example, buying a big house and being tied to a mortgage. They're interested more in experiences. They're more interested in making a difference. I'll give you an example. There was this, I do a bit of executive coaching, and I got handed to me this very young Gen Z person. And she was very keen in terms of the environmental and sustainability, all that sphere. And she was working for this large corporation, right, which was very commercial in its nature. And what she wanted was, she was frustrated because she was not getting ahead fast enough. She'd only been there 6 months, right? And she wanted more responsibility and the kind of job that traditionally you'd have to be there 5 years to get. And she was frustrated that she was not getting it. And this drive to make a difference, and this drive of, it's the most informed generation. It's the generation with the most knowledge. And whether, there is a sense that sometimes knowledge makes you is not enough. I think experience plays a big part. And there's no doubt that they're the most informed generation, but sometimes they dismiss experience. It's almost like, because I know something, I can do it. And there's that impatience around it. So these are the gaps that I think are coming through. What you touched on before, which is like, tell me the why, is a critical, aspect. So they don't want to just be told about something. They really want to understand why. And Monica, what you touched on before about having a voice, is the second thing. They want to be heard. Much, much less than older generations, which had, great respect for hierarchy and were quite happy, as an example, to be told off. And that's what I mean by the gap.
I think Gen Z is comfortable with challenging authority as well. But I don't think that it necessarily comes from a nasty place. I think it comes from, like you said, we want to know why and we want to have the reason why. Being told just isn't a good enough excuse anymore because we have such instant access to knowledge. So having the empathy to explain that.
What you said is exactly what I was thinking, that Gen Z are much more willing to challenge, and it's challenge with respect. It's challenge to seek to understand, why am I doing this, or why do you want it this way? Whereas previous generations would be more, I'll do what the boss says. And
Yeah.
and I think that's a big difference. And I think leaders of today that are of an older generation, they don't like being challenged, and they don't like the young ones actually putting them on the spot, which is, you see that happen sometimes, but it's a good thing, not a bad thing.
No, absolutely. And you talked about empathy, right? In your experience, Tony, is this a case of just training and development because they don't know how to do it, or is it just not? Is it a question of intent, like they don't believe they should do it? Is it an attitudinal issue, or is it a training issue for leaders?
I don't think it's either. I think it's the Gen Z have so much information that I watch my daughter who's a Gen Z. And if you say something she doesn't understand, she grabs her phone and she Googles it to understand. So she's got instant knowledge.
Mm,
Whereas my generation, we had to go up to the library and look it up. And instant knowledge is real power, and they use it well. They use it all the time. And I think it's a really good thing. And I think if anybody needs to be trained, it's the leaders of today to respect the difference, because not only are they managing Gen Z, they're still managing, some of them are managing baby boomers, they're managing people that have different motivations. And we need to understand that to get the best result.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, it's interesting. When I was young, I used to sit at the feet of older people because they had experience, and the best thing about them is they could tell you interesting stories, right? And if they said something, I just took it as the gospel truth, right? I just said, well, this person has been on this planet longer than me. They know what they're talking about. I never questioned it. But now, you know, when I say something and my kids again, they will immediately fact check me. And initially, it used to bug me, you know. I go, well, I said that, it's true, and they'd fact check it. But now it doesn't, because I go, okay, all right, you know, you know, I say something, and then they fact check it, and they know, in fact, it's actually this. And then I go, okay, all right, makes sense, you know. And I think, you know, the older generation just needs to come to grips with they have more information, you know, and that's absolutely interesting. So here's something interesting. This was probably the second biggest driver um, in terms of engagement of Gen Z. Strong desire for regular constructive feedback, right? This annual review thing is too much time between drinks, right? And 42% of the Gen Z people in Australia said they don't get frequent constructive feedback to help them grow. So, what's driving the constructive feedback is this deep desire to grow. They're not getting it. And if they did, let's just say they did, right? Engagement levels would go up by like 46%, so almost by half, right? So, all you need to do is develop a process to do that. Um, so, my question, like literally the engagement level of people that get constructive feedback versus do not get it, goes from 33% to 79%. Quite a big jump just by doing that, correct? But the question for you, Monika, is what kind of feedback actually works for you and your peers?
I think a good style of feedback, it's important to come from a place of understanding for Gen Z. I think for so often there are challenges that we're facing that are really, really new, and we're the first to face these sorts of challenges. So it's coming from a place of empathy and understanding, which you're probably going to hear a lot in this interview. But how that can look is interest in us, you know, like I don't believe that I believe that having rapport with our bosses and management builds so much more of an engagement to us. And things that you mentioned earlier as well, you know, I want to see my company do well when I care about the people who I work with, like in alongside. So I think making sure that the environment is safe enough that we can feel as though
Say something.
feedback is coming and it's constructive, it's not negative, it's not nasty, and we can take it forward in a positive way.
Yeah, I think the intent should be clear, right? You know, it's like this is coming from a good place. So we talked about constructive feedback, Tony, and you know, it's sometimes not an easy thing to do. But it's one of the easiest leadership wins. But why is it kind of missed? Why is it that leaders struggle to deliver this consistently?
I think it goes back to the point that Monika made earlier on about challenge. It can be seen as being negative when it's not, it's a positive thing. And I think sometimes we as human beings like to be nice. We like to have good conversations, but sometimes feedback, challenge coming from the right place is extremely helpful. You know, somebody said to me the other day, we're really good at having a conversation when we're shoulder to shoulder. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, if we're sitting at the football, we can give each other feedback because we're not looking each other straight in the eye. But when we're sitting opposite each other, it's so much harder to really express how you're feeling. I used to say this to the people that work with me. My mother used to say, if I don't tell you, nobody else will. When I'm giving feedback to, some of my reports, I used to use that line and say, listen, please take the feedback. It's coming from a really good place. I'm trying to help you grow. And I believe that the Gen Zs are asking for that feedback, and it's putting some leaders on the spot. And to your point, Chris, they don't want that feedback in a review that happens once a year. They don't want the feedback quarterly. They want the feedback on the go. What went well? Hey, even better if I did what?
Yeah.
And I think in our culture, we've got a lot of work to do to get that. I watch that with our CEOs. Like, I try and get them to go deeper in terms of questioning of one another, go deep. And if it hurts a little bit, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. So this was the second biggest driver. I'll tell you the top driver. I touched on this already. Gen Z want a voice, right? They want people to listen to their suggestions. 56% of Gen Z women and 48% of Gen Z men, right, feel no encouragement to have an open dialogue or share suggestions, right? Which is really sad. It's like 1 in 2 almost, right? Now, let's flip it around. Just by creating an environment where people can share suggestions and have a voice is probably the number one driver. You can take engagement levels right up to 90%. What's the story, Tony? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. Why do you think leaders are failing to give this generation a proper voice and listen to their suggestions?
Do you think the leaders are not giving the Gen Zs a proper voice, or do you think the leaders are not giving their leadership teams the opportunity to have a voice? I worked in James Hardie, and this is in the 90s. And James Hardie spent lots of time getting open dialogue. We used to say things like, no suggestion's a bad suggestion.
Yeah,
You
yeah, yeah.
put the whole room together and you make sure everybody has something to say. I was facilitating a meeting in Melbourne a couple of weeks ago, and there was a lady who would have been 20, and everybody else in the room were in their 40s.
Mm,
I
mm,
really that room to get everybody to put in. And the lady in the room, she summarized what we were doing. She identified where the weaknesses were, and you could have heard a pin drop in the room. Now, she was really reluctant to speak up, but she didn't have a choice because everybody in that room was going to have a turn to speak. So I'm sorry, but I don't think I'm answering your question, but I think we need to create an environment where we encourage everybody to contribute, and we
have
get
a
them
voice.
table. Everyone's got to have a voice. And if you look at Gen Zs, they're fresh, they've got a different approach, they look at things differently. They're the sort of things that are going to take us forward. We need to hear that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So here's one for you, Monica. Now this I have to tell you is common across generations, but it appears to be particularly strong for Gen Z. A link to individual purpose and values. So the organization I work for has similar values, but a link to my personal purpose. Like I want to make a difference in X, Y, Z, and this organization allows me to do that. How important is it for you, and from what you heard from your peers, is this link to personal values and purpose when you work for an organization?
I think that's such a crucial part of ensuring that there is, you mentioned before that I think it was 1 in 2 people leave after 2 years.
Yeah.
And I think having that career growth is so important to align with a company that has similar values to you. I think that making sure that your company values are established and that people know what they are, and that you are constantly, it's not just told to you, you live them. These examples that you set, we see this happening, and that way we don't have to see it a slogan on a wall to know what the mission statement is. We live it, and I think that would make a tremendous impact to everyday.
Yeah. Look, when we do cultural transformation, we definitely develop values, which is like we value XYZ. But we actually have agreed behaviors that sit below that, because sometimes you have a value like, respect or innovation, but what does that really mean? It can mean, 40 different things to people. So we actually have set behaviors, this is what it means. And more important, this is what it does not mean. So when we do that work, it literally, like, it's not just a post on the wall with, high fluting, fancy sounding values, but it's like, this is what it means, this is what it does not mean. And it becomes like a lighthouse on top of the mountain that everyone can refer to and say, hey, you don't have to go directly to someone. You don't have to say, Tony, you were really rude, or you were this, or you were that. You could just go and say, Tony, doesn't align with this value and this behavior. And it becomes a nice common type of thing, but you're right, a lot of people have values, but if someone came in the middle of the night and robbed all the values, I don't think anyone would notice, because it's only when you live it that it becomes real.
And I also think as well, when you say values, personal values, I think values nowadays can also change in the sense of what I want out of work. My value for work is a work-life balance. So I want to see a purpose in my job, but I also want to go home and know that, I shut the door on work and whatever. So transparency is also really important. I need to know before I'm going into a job, am I able to have a hybrid model, or am I strictly on site? Am I, what are the parameters within my role? Are there opportunities to change? Will you have change? I think the transparency is really, really important from leadership to encourage that.
That just nailed it. In terms of my experience with Gen Zs, they don't want to hear macro generalizations. Where their interest lies is if this is the purpose or the vision of the organization, how does my job and my output drive that? It's a really important link, and creating the vision and the values and creating a beautiful little sign and nailing it on the wall is offensive to a Gen Z because it's meaningless.
And as soon as you put it on the wall, if you're not living it, it has the opposite effect, right?
Exactly.
So living it is everything.
So my current boss, my employer, so he came to me and asked me in my 6-month probationary review, like essentially not to say verbatim what is our mission statement, but to explain it. And I realized I hadn't read it, but I just wrote what I thought was our mission statement by the example that he set. And it was nearly verbatim what our mission statement was, which was, to find good people and give them good opportunities, and through the connection.
Let's talk about emotional safety and flexibility. Have you or your peers, and this is all about having a voice again, Monika. Have you or your peers ever felt unsafe speaking up in the workplace, like emotionally, like, if I speak up, maybe I'll get into trouble? It wasn't a conducive environment.
I don't think that speaking up, I'll get into trouble is so much the issue. I think it's kind of an apathy in the senses, if I say something, will it matter? Will it be heard? Will it be listened to? And then if I do something, it's what's the point? Like, why, if I say this and nothing, it doesn't create change, it becomes almost negative. So you don't want to encourage the environment of the workplace, essentially.
Right. So it's just the atmosphere could change. Cool. Okay. Hey, Tony, I want to share something with you. Thanks to COVID, tools like Zoom that we are on and MS Teams, etc., have really taken off. And in our organization, we used to have staff going in to the office. And then because of COVID, we were forced to work from home. And initially, there was a bit of trepidation around working from home. And we kind of put tools in place where people had to log in, what they were doing, how much they were doing. Then after a while, I said, I don't want to do this because what I'm actually saying is I don't trust my people. And trust, I think, is a two-way street. So what we did is we took those tools away as well because they became cumbersome and it's not how I wanted to treat people. And then COVID hit, and what a lot of my staff said to me was, you know what? We are working from home now, and we are working way more than we used to work when we used to go to the office. So flexible work is a big thing for this generation. Why are Australian leaders reticent around this? Is it lack of trust? Because this is something that Australian leaders in the survey are not that keen on doing.
I think it's I believe the problem is we're using old measures. It's not about measuring presence, it's about measuring performance. It feels like lost control, actually, the way it gets managed. And of course, underlying that is trust, the example you've just given is a perfect example. It's not about hours in the office. It's all about outcomes. What are the outcomes from what you've done this week? And I know myself. If I'm working from home, you've got no interruptions, you can get so much more done.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So here's one for you, Monica. In our study, 65% of Gen Z women in Australia, 69% of Gen Z men felt their work places inclusive, right? The leaders actually gave themselves much better marks. They said, 80% of them said they're inclusive. So as far as Gen Z is concerned, when you talk about being inclusive, what does it really mean for your generation from, people you've spoken to?
So as an example, like I've had some peers and they work with non-binary people. And I think it's really important, you don't have to always get things right. You can, I think a lot of my peers who are non-binary have said it's not about always making sure that you're saying it every single time. It's making sure that you're trying to, and if you do, you apologize, or it's making the effort and showing that you're actually there to show up in the way that we're asking.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good example of, inclusivity. No, and look, you need to speak about this because if it's important, then you need to speak about it. And I guess from where I'm coming from is as a leader, I was always taught that you have to understand what makes people tick, right? And if something is upsetting them, then obviously you don't do it, right? So that to me is inclusivity, not just what's your suggestion about this. Inclusivity is like regardless of who you are, you feel that you're included in the organization. No, absolutely. And that's good. Do you think inclusion needs to be a policy, Tony, in an organization, and not just assumed? Like, is it important to say this is the policy and this is what we do, as opposed to rely on people's good intentions?
Sometimes I think we've come a long way with inclusivity, and other times I see that we've still got a long way to go. So in the ideal world, my answer would be no. But currently, I think it does need to be included. I think that we don't respect the power of diversity, the power of having different people sitting at the table that look at things differently. We run the risk of hiring in our own shadow and ending up with a room of people that just agree with the boss. Much better to have different views, because out of the difference comes that gem of an idea that makes a huge difference to whatever it is we're doing. respect Gen Zs, involve them, respect their different view of the world, and use it to your advantage.
Okay, so I suppose what I said at the beginning, there is no doubt that both parties must come to the table. Both generations have different value systems, different beliefs. They've been brought up differently. Um, our generation was more materialistic. The younger generation is less so, and so on and so forth. The Gen Z is the most informed generation out there, et cetera, et cetera. But both parties have to come to the table. There's no doubt, like I said, leaders have to take the first step, but Gen Z can also do something. So my next few questions are kind of like saying what should each party do to come to the table, right? So we'll kick off with you, Monica. If Gen Z can make one mindset shift happen among Australian leaders tomorrow, what would it be?
It would be, to have more empathy and understanding, and to be more open to receiving feedback and giving feedback and communication styles, I suppose.
Cool, cool, cool. And the second one, bit of a tougher question. What's one thing your own generation needs to own up to, in bridging this gap?
I think, it's a good one. Definitely patience. I think, Tony's touched on this and you've touched on this, Chris, as well. And that instant access to knowledge has made us really, really impatient. We've seen people get rich quickly as well. So I think that's also creating a frustration when we see ourselves working 9 to 5 and then someone else getting rich easily. So it is, encouraging the patient, sticking with things, even if it's not easy. We've got to sometimes hit adversity and see it through, I think.
All right, Tony. Many leaders label Gen Z, and I think as soon as you label something, you diminish it, right? As soon as you label something. And they label them as impatient or distracted. Is this, in your mind, is this limiting belief hurting their ability to unlock Gen Z's full potential?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if people have those expectations of you and you can feel it, you start behaving the way they expect you to behave. But if you look at the conversation we've had today, we've said, the best way to get the best out of Gen Z, recognize their effort. Don't tell them what to do, coach them and empower them, give them autonomy and let them go for it. You'll get a great result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. So you have learned from multiple generations, right? I mean, in your role, you've, coached, you probably led baby boomers, even millennials and Gen Zs. You probably learned from each of these generations. What's the biggest thing Gen Z has taught you?
You know what I respect with Gen Z is their thirst for knowledge and their use of the accessibility of knowledge, the way they use it. I went away on a holiday with my daughter. She'd get up in the morning, she'd use AI to develop a schedule for the day. You say, I want to go and have a great breakfast. She's looking for the place to have breakfast. She's looking at the reviews. And I'd stand back and look at that and say, well, gee, I'd walk down, I'd look at a cafe and I'd walk in. Whereas she's using everything she's got at her disposal to make a great decision. And I think that in the workplace, when you people that are doing that, they're gold. You've got to respect that and recognize that by the way, they're the future too. We're not gonna be around forever. They're gonna be running the companies, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing I admire about Gen Z is that everything you said, but I think they're the most socially aware generation. You know, the way they champion things like the environment and sustainability. I mean, we never thought about stuff like that. But the way they champion it and push it, the way they champion diversity, inclusivity, etc., you know, the way they do that and the way they champion it, I think it's admirable, you know, like um yeah, that's what I really admire. And how they use information. And you know, after my initial kind of, you know, bit where I would get fact checked and I'd get upset because I thought it was disrespectful. Now I'm completely the other way. I go, well, that's good. It's an opportunity to know what's right or wrong. And, you know, if the technology is there, you should very well use it.
I feel like that's a really good point to make is although we may not have the answers as of yet on how to help Gen Z and get them to engaged in the way that you want them to, I think that we're going to probably face similar, if not even more exacerbated challenges for Gen Alpha. So I think it's the you know, if you guys have a solution, we're going to have to see it through because it's going to be something, you know, we're only going to go into an age of more technology. And so it's, you know, we need to learn off you guys as well on what we can bring forward.
Yeah, the way I see it is, you know, it's like one generation is the most informed and knowledgeable because the information of the whole world is in the palm of your hands or on your mobile phone, correct? But the other generation has something that you know you can't put a value on, which is experience. Like I've been there, done that. You know, I mean, I'll give you an example. Supposing you go to someone and you say, okay, to ride a bicycle, you need to do A, B, C, D, E, and you say, okay, I'll ride it. But someone who already rides a bicycle can literally tell you in a much better way how to do it. So there's something to be said for experience. And when the two come together, I think it's a whole new ball game, you know, and that's the bridge I think between them. So yeah, and also having this view, and we've talked about this already, is that a manager said to me years ago, you know, nobody has a mortgage on all the good ideas, right? So, you know, acknowledging that different people view things differently and a new generation looks at things in a completely fresh way. And that's a powerful mindset to have, to walk in not with a view of, you know, I'm being challenged here or I'm being disrespected, but it's almost like a mindset of what can I learn from these people? You know, what's new that I can learn? And that would be great. So, all right. So thanks a lot for that. I just want to reiterate two things. I just want to reiterate two things. You know, in our study, we've studied 15 dimensions. The unique thing about it is we get a leader's perspective on saying things like DEI as an example, or empathetic leadership, and we get a view from Gen Z. And then we look at the gaps as an example, which is quite interesting. And we measured 15 dimensions. And we've talked about mainly two, right? Which is constructive feedback and giving Gen Z a voice. Why? Because those are the two most powerful ones. But every organization is different. And what we've actually done is measured 15 different dimensions across this for Gen Z and leaders. So when you get the report, that is what you get, right? Because you can do 15 potentially different things. Now, the next thing is, it's one thing to do a study, and we see lots of studies with graphs and all that kind of stuff. But what we do, because you know, a lot of what we do is employee engagement, is detailed and granular recommendations. So for each and every one of these, this is what you need to do. And I guarantee you, like we looked at it ourselves and said, what if people followed these recommendations? Not all of them, but just a few of them, guaranteed to improve employee engagement. So that's the next thing. The fourth thing we have is with the study, you have like an interactive dashboard where you can do what if analysis. So you can literally look at it and say, if I do this, what impact will it have on engagement overall, right? Then, of course, you need to do your own study for your organization to understand, but the what if analysis. So if I do this, it'll improve engagement by this much. And I just want to reiterate the economic benefits that I covered off before, right? Which is the gap is like 41,000 between an engaged employee and a disengaged employee. Not a line item on your balance sheet, but trust me, it has an impact. And all you need to do, if you just took 10 people and converted them, it's like 400 grand. If you did 100 people, it's like 4 million. And people wax lyrical about productivity, but I reckon leadership and developing the right culture and engaging staff is your number one productivity toolkit. So the link to the study is in the comments, in the first comment, or somewhere in the description. So if you can click on it to understand more, that would be wonderful. I hope this podcast was interesting. Thank you, Monika, and thank you, Tony, for your insights. It's been really, really great to get two different perspectives, but strangely enough, I almost feel like we bridged the gap today, right? We made it easy for people out there. So thank you very much for that. And make sure you like, share, and make comments so we can keep this dialogue going. And thank you again, Tony. Thank you again, Monika, for your time and your patience, and your insight and your input. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. And it was lovely speaking with you, Tony, as well.
That was great. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.